pleasure to have Andres Zervagan, my colleague in the art history department, with us this afternoon. He is on leave this year, so it's particularly kind that he's agreed to come and talk to us about his work. And I wanted to start there. Andres, would you tell us a little bit how you got interested in the history of photography?
So what brought my interest first to the medium was what I was working on as a graduate student, which was a photomontage artist from Germany named John Hartfield. That was a pseudonym. His real name was a German name. And he started making photomontage because he was distressed with what photo wasn't doing in reporting the world around him, around others. This is around the time of World War I. And that failure of photography is what got him interested in pushing the medium to make it represent in ways that it couldn't with just a single seamless image. That pushed him toward photomontage, where you put images together, pieces of them, fragments, and make a composition as if by hand. And that problem, photography's failure, by the perspective of Hartfield, interested me in photography. And my interest has expanded from there to the broader history of the medium.
And at Rutgers, do you teach courses in the history of photography? Can you tell our students a little bit about some of those courses?
Sure. So there are three standard courses. One is the 19th century history of photography. So that includes pre-photo. So I list it as the history of photography 1800 to 1900. And then there's a 20th century history. That's 1900 to 2000. And then contemporary photography, which is basically 2000 to today. So absolutely contemporary.
Well, we're really happy that you can talk to us about photography in the context of the course that, as you know, Rudy Bell and I are teaching a course on 21st century challenges paralleled with similar challenges and events in the past. And the primary evidence that we're using to talk about those events and challenges are the visual ones.
Okay.
And that theme, that broader theme, is particularly relevant to the topic that we're discussing this week, which is the impact of new technologies on the production and circulation of knowledge about the world and about ourselves. And we've talked with Aram Sinreich about the potential and challenges of new technologies, of digital media and the internet. And today we'd like to talk with you about the similar issues involved in the advent of photography.
Okay.
So why don't we start there by talking about that invention. And I know in my own work on 16th and 17th century Northern European art, the camera obscura was used already in the 16th century. What was new about photography in the 19th century?
Well, the way it's commonly understood is that the image of the camera obscura, this moving image that was projected onto the back of the box or back of a room, was fixed. So there was a chemical procedure that allowed that projected image to be put on a silver plate, a copper plate, or on paper. And the key to that was not just finding photosensitive chemicals. That had already been discovered in the mid-18th century. But once you start the process of exposure, there was no way to stop it. For a very long time, people couldn't figure that out. And these chemicals turn dark with the exposure to light. So the discovery of photography, or the invention of it, maybe is a better word, was made when a number of people around the same time figured out how to stop the sensitivity of silver nitrite, silver iodine, these sorts of chemicals to the exposure of light. And there were other challenges that followed that, because light in a photograph should appear light, but because these chemicals turn dark with exposure, it's like oxidization basically, like silver turning dark over the course of time. You had to reverse the equation of light to dark to light to light. And that was the second part of the challenge. So the difference between the camera obscura and the photograph is capturing the image, and of course that means it's a still image and it's black and white.
You said that various people were involved in this invention, and one usually thinks of Louis Daguerre as being the inventor, and in fact giving his name to the daguerreotype. Can you tell us about him and his training? And then also I'm really interested with this invention, how people responded to it, how it was presented to a public.
So the good, rich questions. So Daguerre is only one of a number of people who are, at around the same time, able to figure out this puzzle of fixing the image of the camera obscura. And I should add, too, that there were other types of images that people were trying to fix. For example, images across a visual spectrum to capture the various components of light. That was running also parallel to the invention of photography and contributed to it. We think of Daguerre very much because his invention was effectively given the imprimatur of the French state. And that was in August of 1839. He was, the French state basically bought his invention and made it publicly available. Anyone could use it without a patent. And in return, they gave Daguerre an annuity for the rest of his life. He had basically an income from the French state. And I think that's why people generally see him as the inventor of photography, because of that public recognition. The other people, their other technologies weren't necessarily recognized. One guy, Henry Fox Talbot from the UK, from the United Kingdom, he invented a procedure that was actually a negative-positive process. That's how he got over the problem of having light burn dark in exposure. He would take the negative, which was the light looking dark, expose it to more photosensitive paper, and you would get a positive. But that procedure was not bought by the British state. He tried to enforce patents on it, and that made it very unappealing for most people practicing photography. But the main reason that I think the daguerreotype proved so popular was that its visual fidelity was really high. It was very sharp, and that was immensely appealing for the primary purpose of the daguerreotype, which was portraiture. People wanted precise images of themselves and of their family, and that's what the daguerreotype provided. But the problem with the daguerreotype was that it was a one-off image. It's called a direct positive. He made the negative image positive by exposing it to mercury vapor, and you couldn't reproduce that. You had this one-off image that basically would be in a case and handled like a piece of jewelry. They were also quite small. So the reaction initially was one of elation. People couldn't believe that he had been able to capture the projected image of the camera obscura at all. And the fidelity of the image was really quite astounding. Edgar Allan Poe wrote in 1840 some odd date, I can't remember exact date, that the great thing about the daguerreotype was that it was truth to likeness. It was absolutely 100% in correspondence with that which it had photographed. And he wrote beautifully about this. A little bit later, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote with the daguerreotype in mind, this is all in the United States, that there's no longer any need for reality, basically, for objects, because the photograph now replaces the object. The form replaces the object. Now we only need form. A little bit like what one might have thought in The Matrix. This idea that there's no more need for reality because the representation of reality has overtaken the actual experience of reality.
So interesting. I want to talk about, with some specific images, how closely those daguerreotypes actually replicated reality. But just to come back, the involvement of the French state. Why was the French state interested in this invention, and why do you think it was interested in making it available to everybody rather than having exclusive rights?
Probably a number of reasons. One is that it was picked up by the French Academy of Sciences. I think they felt it was a way to advance France's scientific pioneering status in Europe at the time. You have to remember, in 1839, science is almost just fresh as a discipline, as a distinct discipline, and this placed France at the forefront of visual invention, scientific invention. That's one reason, but also I believe in the background was the idea that this would be an economic boom for France, that it would open up whole new industries, and in fact it did. It opened up what was called daguerreotype mania, where on every corner, within a year after the announcement of the invention, there were photo studios, people making daguerreotypes, and these were largely people who had been failed portrait painters or lithographers who switched to this medium thinking they could earn much more money. And so in that sense it did create an economic boom.
So let's turn to one of Daguerre's early works that you brought in for us, the Boulevard du Temple. Can you talk a little bit about what we're looking at, first of all?
Okay, so the scene is from Daguerre's atelier. It's if you look at the date, you can see it's before the announcement. It's 1838, and the announcement. Well, first, Arago, this man who was in the French Academy of Sciences, who took up the cause of getting the daguerreotype purchased by the state, he announced that there existed this procedure with no more details in January of 1839, and then the actual announcement of the procedure itself, all the details of how an image could be made, was August of 1839. So this is 1838. He's still experimenting. He can't let anyone know what the chemical secret is, so he's confined to his studio. He takes pictures of still lives that he sets up, and this scene from his window. And this is Central Street in Paris. It's very crowded, but if you look at the image, you'll see there's almost no one there, because the exposure was so long, 10 to 20 minutes, depending on the light at that time of day. It just couldn't capture emotion, and this is one of the problems of the daguerreotype, in addition to the fact that it couldn't be replicated. So you have to imagine that this street, the Boulevard du Temple, was just packed with many, many people. There is actually one person in this one of two versions of his view from the atelier, and that is a man on the bottom left. You can see him on the corner, just a kind of faint apparition, and the reason you can see him almost completely, but not quite, is because he was having his shoe shined, and that meant that he stood still long enough that he appeared in the image. So people, upon the announcement of the daguerreotype, when this a year later was made public, lamented that the exposure times meant it was very difficult to capture humans, and babies impossible, because they always want to move. So that was, people enjoyed the fact that there was such extraordinary detail in the final version of this. This is already not quite so visually true as what became the official daguerreotype, but they didn't like that it took so long. You couldn't capture humans very well, and it was black and white. It wasn't really like the world as you saw it in a camera obscura, which was color and moving.
It reminds me of Baudelaire's critique of photography, where he, in fact, it seems to be the opposite of what Poe was saying, that the problem with photography is that it's going to mean that there will be no more art, in fact. And in this respect, it seems really that the fact that we're looking at an image of Paris without any people, and that wouldn't have been the way Paris looked. Susan Sadlauskas and I talked about Degas' painting of Place de la Concorde, and that just about 30 years later, and it's interesting the idea of Paris that painting projects, and one that's very different from what we see here.
Yeah.
I wanted to move now to another person who was involved in the invention of this new art form with the self-portrait by Hippolyte Bayard. And to begin here by talking about, first of all, who took this photograph and who are we looking at? Is this indeed a self-portrait?
It is a self-portrait. I don't know if it's clear whether or not he managed to take it himself. He probably did. At this moment, the exposures were so long that you could take the cap off the lens and then go and stand before the camera, stay still for a number of minutes, and then run back, put the cap on. Because remember, at this time, the technology is so slow, it couldn't capture you if you were moving. So he may have taken it himself that way, or had an assistant help him, but he probably took it himself. And it is Hippolyte Bayard, and he's posing as a drowned man. And he's done this because he also tried to get his invention of photography, which is different than what Daguerre had invented. It was, again, a direct positive, so it couldn't be reproduced, but it wasn't as true visually to the objects that were photographed, and so it wasn't picked up. And Daguerre had basically already won that award, and there was only going to be one. So he was a civil servant, he had a career, but he was very disappointed with this inability to secure an annuity, or to get the recognition, actually, it seems he really wanted for his process. And so here he's posing as a drowned man. The idea being that because his process wasn't recognized, he, in despair, kills himself. he didn't, of course, kill himself because, for one, he took the photo, so he was alive, but also he went on to be one of the best calotype photographers of France in the decades that followed, and worked for, among other people, L21STHFHP, making fantastic images for these volumes of books that were photos of various parts of France, the Middle East, Egypt. So he had a great photo career after this, even if his process wasn't picked up.
So in this one, what are we? He's in the water. Is that his hat next to him?
It's odd, isn't it? Because he's basically taken off his shirt and put his head back and closed his eyes, so he could also be at rest. But what he claims in the caption to the photo is that he's dead, and that he's been dead for a while. So you could maybe imagine that he's washed up ashore from the banks of the Seine, maybe, or he's floating in the water. That's not entirely apparent, except that there's a hat to the right, his right, on the left as you see it here, and that would suggest that he's not actually in the water, but he's somewhere else. It's not entirely clear, in part because the image isn't very clear. His process wasn't very good, and that's apparent here.
And what function was it supposed to serve? You said it's making an argument for his role in the invention of photography, but can you say more about the caption and how that works in conjunction with the photograph?
Well, there's a great deal of mystery about this function of the photo. It may have been for himself, or it may have been to share with friends. Remember, it's not a reproducible procedure, so there's only one of these. And the caption is his own lament. Maybe he, again, might have been sharing it about the failure of the recognition for this process by the French state or anyone else. He was, forgotten, basically, until he became a great photographer later. And so it could be that he was working out his own despair with this photograph. It could also be that he meant this to be joined with other images that he had used as demonstration pieces to try to secure the annuity, to kind of close the story with this story of failure and suicide. It's not clear. And there may be some research out there which has clarified exactly what he intended this photo to do, whom he was going to show it to, that sort of information. But as far as I know, that's not been found out yet. But it is a fantastic representation of those who were on the verge of discovering a photographic procedure, or who had, and then were not recognized. There are a whole bunch of these people. There were about 25, 30 people who had already discovered a photographic procedure or were on the verge of it when Daguerre's procedure was announced.
But I also think it's a great example, and it's your example that you brought in, of how the photograph is staged. And then the question, if you don't know if he actually took the photograph, is a photograph something that is made or simply taken?
Yeah.
So you have the fabricated nature of the photograph, and then also an inscription. So the photograph is making an argument. And I wonder if we could move our conversation in that direction, if this in fact is early evidence for the photograph being used to persuade, or potentially as propaganda, to present one side of an event, one version of an event.
I think you definitely could make that argument, in part because when we look back, we forget the degree to which photography, even at the time, was understood by many people to be an incomplete sort of representation. That it wasn't an autonomous, closed, fixed set of meanings. That it actually could be inflected, the meaning of a photo. And so what makes it useful for persuasion is that it seems to be reality etching itself, reality making itself, caught, basically, as a still image. And therefore, it's uninflected by anything. It's just authentic reality caught. But in fact, photos are always a fragment of reality, and therefore there's decisions that take place in this procedure. Which part of what lies before you to photograph? And then in turn, how to inflect the meaning. The caption is very important in that respect, because as an incomplete text, visual text, the caption can add and help complete the meaning, inflect it in a certain way, the sense that the photo is real can be harnessed to give a sense that what you see, which is actually contingent, on various factors, is in fact reality. It makes the image all the more persuasive. It's a roundabout way of saying that because photos can mean many different things but seem real, you can harness that and really make your argument convincing. So in this case, this is part of his larger argument that he had actually developed a viable photographic procedure that should have been recognized, that he's a great inventor, that he also deserved to be a relatively wealthy man like Daguerre had become because of the French annuity, but he was slighted, he was overlooked. It was not the fault of his technology or he himself, but other factors. And this photograph with the caption on it, in a way, shows how rightfully despondent he was. This is someone who should have committed suicide because of this great injustice. And the image is, of course, made, it's not taken. It's not as if he really did commit suicide and then was caught in a river. That's a very modern way of understanding photography. Remember, the procedure, the exposure was very long, and you generally needed to do this in a studio. In a sense, all photos were made at the time. None were taken. They were all staged. So you have to push away this idea that a photo is taken, like with an SLR, single lens reflex camera, or a cell phone camera, and understand that there's a great deal of planning behind most early 19th century photography.
Well, it's also a portrait of himself, a self-portrait. So let's move into this topic of portraiture, because it seems very much linked to photography and the way that the medium was used. It was difficult to photograph a human being because of the long exposure. And you brought in the first example of the Fitz Jr. Self-portrait. How was this made? And just to give us a sense of the difficulty of portraying a likeness of a human face.
Well, very difficult. When Daguerre revealed his process in August of 1839, he stopped working with it. He didn't add anything to it. It was up to others to enhance the process, to make it faster so the exposure times could be brought down. So this is, as you see, 1839. It's before those new technologies were added to the recipe, as it were. And therefore, it took a great long time to sit for this. Fitz had to possibly place himself before the lens for as much as 8 minutes. Depending on the extreme, the intensity of the sun. This had to be done outdoors or in a studio with a skylight. So in order to keep himself able to sit still and not move for this great degree of time in direct sun, probably, he had to close his eyes. So that's why you have this really odd-looking, almost like post-mortem photo. He too looks dead. But it's, again, so that he can sit still long enough to have the exposure done. This later was fixed by 1840. It's amazing that an American could do this in 1839, and that's because when the formula was released for the daguerreotype in 1839 in August in Paris, it was printed almost simultaneously, and those printed booklets were disseminated very quickly around the world. And the first boats that arrived in New York with Daguerre's pamphlet aboard were immediately grabbed by interested people like Fitz, and the technology was instantly realized. So this is August that it was released. You have to remember, crossing the Atlantic took months, possibly 2 months, and yet still it could be realized like this. Without the improvements, though, so this is a very carefully staged photograph.
Yeah, and then you mentioned the studios. So Fitz opened a photography studio in Baltimore and photographed a range of people, although I'm making that assumption. Who were the clients of early photography portraits?
Remarkably diverse clients. So there were the people who could easily afford the technology. Remember, the daguerreotype is made on a silver-coated copper plate, and part of the enhanced technology that allowed daguerreotypes to be made with less exposure time was gold. So there are all these extremely valuable minerals and such that make up the procedure. So it was a bit expensive. but cheap enough that if you were middle class or more wealthy, you could have your photo taken.
And what did people do with these photographs?
Well, the daguerreotype is unique, and the Americans loved the daguerreotype more than almost any other nation. So we stuck with it for like 20 years, even though other technologies came before that. They were used mostly as, well, actually, it's a good question. There are a great diversity of uses. Because they were generally small, this is probably a whole plate. Whole plates were about this size, but most people took an image on a quarter plate, which is like this size. So you would have a little case provided to you in which the daguerreotype was placed, and it was a little bit like a piece of jewelry. You would close the case and store the image. You wouldn't generally expose it for very long because in the early days they were sensitive to light still. But the additional factor was that the daguerreotype was very sensitive. You couldn't touch its surface. I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes who compared the surface to a butterfly wing, that kind of dusty powder on the butterfly's wing. So that's another reason they had to be encased. They could also be encased in, literally in a jewel and worn as a locket or a brooch. This was common. They could also be put in a frame and hung on a wall, but that was very unusual for the daguerreotype. They were mostly in the cases.
And when you look at these early examples,
Mm-hmm.
what do you learn about the people? What image are they conveying of themselves through these stagings
Yeah.
of themselves in daguerreotypes?
Well, this is what's most important to remember. These are very carefully staged images. And most people who are posing for this want to be in their Sunday best. They want to look at, their most prim and proper. Remember, these are middle class and above clients, and there are certain modes of decorum, certain rules, how one should look, what kind of clothes you should wear, how you should comport yourself. There are no smiles. Everyone's very serious in these images. And so you get a sense of a very rigid early Victorian society in the United States, even though that may not have been the case. But because people are producing an image of themselves, often at the urging of the studio owner, you get a kind of uniform, rigid look, which is generally what people wanted anyway. But it is a cultivated stage look that you have to remember doesn't necessarily reflect the lived experience of early Victorian American society. It could be, in fact, quite different. And another thing to remember as well, these are mostly middle class and above white European Americans. There are some slaves whose images were taken, sometimes for scientific purposes.
And Fitz did a couple of those, right, in Baltimore?
Yeah, that he and a number of other people. But it was very difficult if you were a slave, of course, or on the social or racial margins of the United States to be able to afford this, and also just to even get access to a studio. Another thing to remember, you didn't take your own photos. You had to go to a studio to have this done. It was a complicated procedure.
Mm-hmm. And yet, at the same time, it opened up an opportunity that wasn't available before to represent oneself.
Yes, it's true. Unlike painting or beyond painting, it was a great democratization of portraiture. That is what the daguerreotype made possible, because in the United States there was a great big mass of middle class people able to afford this. But though it did do that, there's still a great uniformity in the way these look. It's only with the invention of the tintype later that people can actually have much more liberty, because of the costs being so low, to stage themselves a little bit more in a relaxed way. There are a lot of humor tintypes where people joke in front of the camera, and then with the Kodak in 1888, that technology made it possible to take your own photograph. And then the great democratization that had been promised by Daguerre, in fact, unfolded. And then there are all kinds of really great, wild self-presentations in photography.
Yeah. And we're bringing that topic up to today in our course.
Good.
So thank you very much. It's
You're
a wonderful
welcome.
conversation.
You're welcome.